Good evening, everyone. I'm going to focus tonight particularly on the high seas. Why the high seas? Because they're huge and very important. And it's also a personal passion. I've always been interested in the high seas, this area which is beyond national jurisdiction. You're outside the normal legal framework that we face when we're on land in any kind of sovereign territory. And why now? Well, because there's a new high seas treaty that is being negotiated under the United Nations banner. It's been negotiated for the last 10 years. It very nearly got there in August, and there is optimism that it will fall into place next year. And that is the United Nations Treaty for Biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So it's this interesting conundrum. How do you manage areas where there's no single country that can say this is the law? In other words, it goes to international law, which is rather weak and fragmented. Nobody gets what they want, so they're always arguing. There's wriggle room. But we have this new treaty which is coming along, which will join other treaties, particularly Climate Change Treaty, Biodiversity Treaty, and the Law of the Sea Convention, which date back to the 80s and 90s. So this is a significant update. I've broken the talk down into three heads because I think the context of the high seas is, first of all, the romantic view we have, or a lot of us have, perhaps, about the high seas. So a bit about the romance of the high seas. Then the increasing use of the high seas. What are we doing with the high seas now? And what dangers do they face as a result of that? And that is the chaos, if you like, of my title, Chaos and Control. Well, that's the chaos, is the use. And then finally come to control, and we'll go back into that treaty, what it's trying to do, where it's got stuck, and the sort of arguments that are going on, the geopolitics, if you like, of trying to create these very big treaties. So I think this is probably the most boring slide I put together, but I thought it would be good to have some stats just at the start, just to emphasize how big and how important it is. That our oceans represent 71% of the Earth's surface, and of that, 64% of those are high seas. They're outside national jurisdiction, which means if you take Antarctica into account as well, which, okay, is a continent, it's land, but nearly half the Earth's surface is outside the jurisdiction of any one country. So it has to depend on international law. And the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, have a target that we should have designated protection for 30% of the oceans by 2030. So the 30 by 30 rule is what they're trying to follow. We're a long way from that. The designated protection areas at the moment are within the territorial seas, which within 12 miles, about 7% is designated globally. Exclusive economic zones, about 4%, that's out to 200 miles. And in the high seas, only 1.2%. So we have an awful long way to go before we can achieve that IUCN target, which is only 8 years away, nearly 7 years away. So first of all, this first section about the romance of the high seas and our love for beauty, space, and danger, and freedom from rules, and this idea you can go anywhere, do anything, and there isn't going to be a policeman who's tapping you on the shoulder and saying, no, you can't do that. And I don't know, many of you probably have read Robert Macfarlane's Mountains of the Mind, when he very much considers our attachment to mountains. What is it that draws people to mountains and do ridiculously dangerous things? I like to think similarly there is high seas of the mind, Very few of us will go there, but we all have an image of what the high seas are and what they mean to us. And there was just this little quotation he used in his first chapter, which is this restless passion. Why do people climb mountains? Why do people row across the Atlantic? Why do they sail around the world? Why do they go out into space? What is it about danger and space that attracts us? Even if we don't do it, we read the stories and we think, God, that's exciting. You know, I wish I was strong enough to do that, or I had the money to do that. Our first love probably is for the habitats and the species that we know are in the seas. We all probably have a favorite. Most of them focus on these larger mammals and fish which live in the seas. We're attracted to these big, attractive creatures. For me, manta ray, I think, is just fantastic. Very few will see one. I did have the chance to dive with manta rays a few years ago. Beautiful creatures, but we all have our favorite. And then from that gaping mouth, you can see that it's scooping up zooplankton to keep it going. So the very bottom of the food chain running through to this top fish. As far as marine science is concerned, you know, the deep sea, until very recently, has been a complete mystery to us. You know, strange and fantastic were the images that our grandparents and great-grandparents had, particularly if they were working with the seas, if they were fishers. Here'd be monsters, and the fantastic stories would come back of what was in the seas. The first real effort at investigating the deep sea, the high seas, was HMS Challenger in 1872 to 1876. It went on a 4-year voyage, supported by the British government. You won't be surprised to hear, for economic reasons. And so much of our marine science has been driven by our wish to use the seas, to use this space. In the case of HMS Challenger, it was the first telecommunication cables. They wanted to know what was there so they could connect the empire and connect to other countries. And so they provided the ship and they provided some of the funding for a group of 6 scientists, but I think about 197 crew on HMS Challenger went around the world over those 4 years. And much to their surprise, they found there were things there, that it was a living environment. You know, there was speculation even before they went that the deep sea was dead, that there was nothing there. And of course, HMS Challenger came back, having taken dredges and samples all around the world, and say, no, it's full of life. There is life in these seas. So our first reason to love the high seas is our image of the life that's in the high seas. And then the human use of the seas perhaps reaches its peak in the big, fast sailing ships at the end of the last century. The Cutty Sark, probably one of the fastest and the most beautiful vessels to go around the world. It started its life as a tea clipper going to China, and then switched to the wool trade from Australia, reaching Australia in just over 70 days. So a fast, beautiful ship that represented a sustainable use of the oceans, if you like, but very tough conditions, very tough for the people who had to work them. And then I've learned how to use word cloud, which is great. Just a few names. You know, I could have listed 100 names of poets, of authors, of artists, of explorers, everyone who's taken an interest in the sea and has recorded their interest and expressed that interest in the ocean. I don't know, I could choose any few of them. I'll choose a couple around the world people, because I think the the round-the-world yachtsmen and yachtswomen with Ellen MacArthur there, just down from the top. But starting with Joshua Slocum. I don't know if you know of his, I've got his book here, Sailing Alone Around the World. He was 51 years old when he set off from the east coast of the United States and sailed around the world in 1895. He came back in 1898. And his was a very social journey. It was about connectivity. So he was connecting with peoples and places around the world. And he took 3 years to do it in his 35-foot sloop called Spray. But of course, the world he was visiting, when you read his book, which is a fabulous read, actually, it's a great book about the ocean and traveling around it. But the people he visited, it was very much a colonial. You know, he had dinners with governors, he had dinners with admirals. He met the colonists. There's hardly a mention in there of native peoples, except when they obstructed him in Antigua by demanding custom dues or something like that. So it's a very colonial journey. Then we come to the more modern round the world yachts people. And it's all about technology and speed. The social side of it seems to have gone. It's about how quickly you can do it and what equipment you can use. Slocum took 3 years. Francis Chichester took 276 days, stopping in Sydney. Ellen MacArthur went round in 2005 in 71 days. And then Francois Gabard, the French yachtsman, set the record of 42 days in 2017. So it's just get around there as quickly as you can. Forrester and Melville, the great novels, Magellan, the great explorer, Hamid Innes, the great adventure book writer, Horatio Clare, who writes very much about modern shipping, about going around the world on a container vessel, and more about those later. And then T.S. Eliot and some of his poems, Hemingway. And my favorite is Eric Newby, great travel writer, very funny, great explorer, great traveler, a great writer, and also a very funny writer. And his story I just find extraordinary. When he was 18, he signed up as deckhand on the Mashulu, and this is the Mashulu, which was still conducting commercial voyages just before the Second War. They were suspended during the war, but it went back to actually running commercial sailing ship cargo trips between Australia and the UK right up to 1948. I was alive in 1948. I was born in 1946. So the fact that this trade using sailing vessels went on so late into the 20th century surprised me before I read Eric Newby's book. So he signed up when he was 18. They actually sailed from Ireland when he was 19. And they went in ballast to Australia to collect grain and then came back. And there were 13 vessels doing it then. And they raced. And Mashulu won it that year in 1939 and came back in 91 days from Australia. It was still a very hard life on these sailing boats right the way up to 1948. You know, it was bugs and weather and fights with the crew and taking that period of time at sea. It was a tough, tough life that those sailors faced. And incredibly, he took with him at 19, he took his camera, he took some amazing pictures of one of these sailing vessels on a major voyage right the way across the world, and some pretty horrendous rough conditions. This is a little bit personal, this one, because it's very significant to my topic of the high seas. Back when I was 18, in 1964, a series of pirate radio, so the older people amongst you may remember them, a series of pirate radio ships set up around the coast of the UK. Because up until that point, the BBC had a complete stranglehold on radio broadcasting. And they didn't broadcast pop music, except on a Sunday afternoon when you had Alan Freeman and the Top 10. That was it for the week. So these pirate radio ships saw an opportunity for commercial radio by mooring themselves just a few meters over the 3-mile limit, because then the high seas started 3 miles off, which is nothing. And that was in the 60s. And this one, particular one, Radio London, actually became the most popular radio station in Europe in just 3 short years. And the government couldn't do anything. I thought that was great. I mean, the 1960s were a bit of a rebellious decade anyway for young people. Having these radio stations cocking a snook at the government and saying, well, you can't do anything, we're in international waters. We can do what we want. We can set up a successful commercial radio business, which they did. But of course, the government was horrified. You know, the BBC monopoly was threatened, and these people might broadcast anything. And they did. But it was a founding ground for some of the most famous DJs. John Peel started on Radio London. Kenny Everett started on Radio London. Tony Blackburn, who's still going, God help us, started on Radio London. So it was a spawning ground of a whole different culture for radio broadcasting in the UK. Because when the government eventually got rid of them by making it illegal to supply them, so they starved them out they couldn't get supplies. They set up Radio 1, Radio 2, Radio 3, Radio 4. So it completely changed the nature of broadcasting. And within the Law of the Sea Convention, under the section on the high seas, one of the prohibited activities is unauthorized broadcasting, largely because of what they tried to do. But there were worries about all sorts of things being set up. You know, you could set up casinos, floating casinos at 3.1 miles or whatever. All these things that were illegal within jurisdiction could be done if they fell outside jurisdiction. So that excited me about the high seas. So moving on to the chaos, to the use of the high seas and the rising pressures from people. And I mean, the big one is pollution, of course. I mean, we worry about acidification of the oceans. We worry about the plastic in the oceans. We worry about the waste that we're pouring into the oceans. One ocean, connectivity, everything is connected. You put it in the river, it ends up on the other side of the world. That picture in the top right, I just pinched off the BBC site this week when they reported on a beach, not so much a beach, a bit of coast in the Ascension Islands, where it's about as remote as you can get. And it's just full up of plastic from all over the world has ended up there. But most of that pollution and this use of the oceans as free space for waste, it's a terrestrial problem, not so much an ocean problem. 80% of it is coming from the land in one form or another, and only 20% is actually engendered within the area of the sea itself and for the various ocean activities. But that's still a lot. So the most chaotic and dangerous use is the use of the space for waste. And then shipping, again, connectivity. This is a fairly recent representation of the use of the oceans for connections. The busiest routes are those yellow ones, coming from China to Europe and to the United States of America. It's the very essence of globalization. This is what's happened to us since the 1950s, even more fairly recently. But who knows what's going to happen now? The pandemic has changed a lot, and some of those routes are not as busy as they were expected to be. The OECD, Organization for Economic Construction and Development, estimated it would double by 2030. That's from 2015. And it's already pretty busy. And I was very struck by some figures I heard, and I can't remember the exact numbers. But if you think of a bottle of Budweiser beer, and let's say in the States it's marketing for $2. Now, if it's brewed in the States, then it costs $1 to brew it, and there's $1 for marketing and selling and making profit. If you brew it in Shanghai, and I can't remember the actual figures, but this is what they do, you can brew it for 25 cents. And to ship it to America costs only another cent or a fraction of a cent. So landed in the States, it's already increased your margin by a huge amount. And that's what globalization has done to us. We've moved our production to cheap areas, and this very cheap shipping, employing these very large container vessels, keeps the price very low, very cheap, and it's cheaper to do things in cheap wage areas than it is to do it at home. But therein lies the problem. I mean, therein lies Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and Viktor Orban and all the rest of them, and Brexit. Then subsea cables and pipelines. This again is a fairly up-to-date view of subsea cables, not pipelines. Pipelines are also very important. But here again, I mentioned before, the economic driver, which is driving the marine science. It's looking for answers about what can go where. And we're now concerned about the security of these cables and pipelines. You know, as international order breaks down, these are extremely vulnerable but essential items of our infrastructure, which enable us to live in the way we've set up to live in a globalized world. And the very first cable was put across in 1856 to 1858 from Ireland to Newfoundland, and it lasted 3 weeks before it was irreparable. Just time for Queen Victoria to send a message to President Buchanan saying, "Hi James, love Vicky." And that took 25 hours to send and whatever. And they went back in the 1860s, and Brunel's Great Eastern was designed as a liner, but was converted as a cable carrier. And that's her in Newfoundland in 1866, when a number of successful cables were put across. And again, connectivity. And in these days, security. And this isn't strictly relevant to the high seas, but I can't resist a picture of my hero. And with a name like that, you've got to be a hero. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the great civil engineer, the great entrepreneur, to which we owe so much of the way we live now in the way of railways, bridges, and ships. And it's just a magnificent picture, isn't it, of a man in his prime. It would seem, but that was 1857 when he was photographed, and he died in 1859. So he had another couple of years to go, and he was only in his 50s. And this is the one that's exercised the minds of everyone and has driven the agenda for quite a number of years now, which is seabed mining and concern about what it would do to the ocean environment. There are seemingly easy to recover valuable minerals scattered right the way across the globe. Seemingly easy to recover because they're not easy to recover. The technology is still very expensive. But this idea that seabed mining was imminent was a prime mover in the law of the sea negotiations in the 1970s up to the 1980s. But then the industry never took off for one reason or another, the main reason being that it was never commercial and still is not commercial. There are a number of companies looking at it. Those two green ringed areas are two areas where recovery licenses have been issued, but the one in Papua, and they're both in EEZs. So the Papua New Guinea one are those three red dots. So Papua New Guinea was able to issue the licenses themselves. And the one at the bottom here, it just catches the New Zealand EEZ around the Chatham Islands. And Boskalis have a license to recover seabed minerals from there. But otherwise, there have been a lot of investigation licenses issued, exploration licenses, but no more recovery licenses across the major resource areas, which are in much deeper sea and spread out across mainly the Pacific and parts of the Atlantic Ocean. But the potential environmental damage is huge. What we do know about the deep sea is nothing moves down there. And once you start mining it and digging it up, then silt plumes would last for centuries, if not millennia, in the deep sea. But it's been a driver of legislation and still is a driver of legislation, which I'll come back to when we talk about rule. And then our newer industries, wind, wave, tidal, and fossil energy. Fossil on the way out, wind, wave, and tide very much the industry of the moment, but mainly within the EEZs, not necessarily high seas at the moment. I suppose that's possible in the future. But here the search is for technology and for space. And when we talk about wind farms, for example, we're talking huge areas of space. And of course, renewable energy is a good. We all want to cut our emissions, but it's still heavy industry. It's still steel and concrete and vessels and oils and hydraulics and noise. So it is a good, but it is still heavy industry. And then at the moment, only close to shore fish farms, which concern us a lot, but not a high seas industry. And then fisheries themselves. This is Atlantic Dawn. It was Irish, constructed 98, 99. It's the largest trawler in the world. Should never have been built is the general opinion, but it was. And it's still fishing. It's been fishing off Shetland quite recently. And except now it's owned by the Netherlands and it's been renamed the Annelies Elena. But it was part of the big Irish expansion into large offshore fisheries. The top 10 high seas fisheries are there, with Japan well in the lead at about over 2.5 million tons. The rest coming in, most of them above 500,000. It's still, the high seas catch is still less than 10% of the total catch. Our catch total is around about 80 million tons a year now around the world. And about 10% of that is, less than 10%, is coming from high seas fisheries. But when you come to controlling these high seas fisheries, they're outside national jurisdiction. and you're trying to persuade countries to change their behaviours in the fisheries, then it's all the developed countries that have got the biggest interest. It's not the smaller countries. It's the United States and Japan and Taiwan, Chile, Spain, France. France total mainly because they have so many overseas territories from which they fish the high seas. Those light blue areas around the coast are the exclusive economic zones. The darker turquoise area are the high seas. Then coming to how do we pull this together? How do we rule the high seas? How do we manage to get 193 countries to agree to behave in a certain way? And it's very, very difficult because they don't agree. They've all got their own interests, and every treaty you ever read has got a lot of wriggle room in it. This won't count, or that won't count, or people find if it's important enough to an important enough country, then they'll find clauses within the treaty which enable them to circumvent some of the stricter procedures that you might want to introduce. But you're trying to get them to give up a bit of their sovereign freedom to act. And that's tough. This little sort of web, and I don't ask you to read it, this web of maritime treaties, EU directives and UK laws, this was drawn up by Sue Boys of Hull University. Those orange boxes in the middle represent international treaties, international laws. We'll come back to some of the key ones in a moment. The dark red are EU directives. And the EU has probably been better than most in interpreting international law and incorporating it into a series of directives which are more enforceable than international law is. And then the light green ones, the last outer ring, the penultimate ring, are the UK laws and regulations which draw from the international law, which go to European directives, which go to UK law. And the argument goes back a long, long way in how we manage the seas. How should we manage the seas? And I could go back to the Romans, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, or whatever. They all came up with ways and agreements that trade could take place. I mean, the two key requirements were trade, security, and fishing. So fishing, trade, and security was what these countries were after. But the clearest route lies with these two chaps. Hugo Grotius, who in 1609 wrote a treatise on the freedom of the seas, Mare Liberum, and he was responded to by John Selden, who actually wrote that in 1618 but published in 1635, who argued about the rights of states to enclose the seas, to take them into private or take them into jurisdiction. So there are two competing views here which run to this day. It's never, ever been resolved. It's the same argument. The argument between freedom of the seas, to which many people are wedded or have a romantic view about it. You know, it's marvelous. We've got these free areas where anyone can go and you can do what you like, freedom of fishing, freedom of navigation. And an argument brought right up into recent times about whether countries could enclose area of the seas and their resources. And that was going on in the 1980s with Reagan and Thatcher, and the idea there was an argument if you privatize the resource, it will be looked after. Yes, we've all been there. So the argument continues, and it didn't really move much for the next 300 years. There were 3-mile territorial seas most people talked about, and I've heard Sandy use it the other day in a talk he was giving, that it was rumoured to be the 3 miles was the limit of a cannon shot. So that was the limit to which a land-based state could protect its waters by having cannon on shore. So we sort of go right the way forward 300 years to President Truman, who in 1945 asserted, there was no legal basis for it, but he asserted the right of the United States to the oil and mineral resources in the Gulf of Mexico within the limit of their continental shelf. So this introduced the idea that the land of a sovereign state, and we all work in this area, sovereignty is everything, and that's still recognized in treaties. But the land of a sovereign state extended out beneath the sea to some limit you could identify, where before it became the deep sea and became international. So this launched the offshore oil industry, which was then just nibbling its way out from the coast of Texas, and then moved out into the sea, and eventually, of course, out into the North Sea here. And there were other pushing of boundaries in the 1970s by assertion. So Iceland stands up, but there were many other countries asserting their rights to increasingly large areas around their coasts. So Iceland in particular extended the 3 mile limit to 12, and then to 50, and then eventually to 200 miles. And the British took exception to that because the big East Coast fishing fleets were going up to Iceland for most of their catch. Big fleets from Grimsby and Lowestoft, which don't exist anymore. And we have what was called the Cod War, which Iceland won, basically. And as more and more countries and international law caught up with this idea of increasing limits, we moved into a larger territorial sea and an exclusive economic zone, or initially fishing zones, but then exclusive economic zones of 200 miles, and the high seas starting outside that. So it brought a lot more of the sea into national jurisdiction as opposed to international jurisdiction. I just like that other headline there, pound sinks to new low. That's a bit familiar, isn't it? Except then £1 was worth $1.8. And then one of the major conventions, and the major convention concerning the sea, is the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention from 1982. And this came after some other conventions from 1958, but this sort of wrapped it up, and it's the one we work to today. It's changed very little. It doesn't need to change because it's now outdated, but it's changed very little. And this set up these jurisdictional zones in the oceans. That took 15 years to negotiate, from 1967 to 1982, and took another 12 years to come into force in 1994. This is the sort of length of time it takes to persuade countries or find words which will satisfy all these 193 countries that they should sign up. But even with this very important convention, it's still not ratified by a number of countries. UK didn't ratify it until Tony Blair came to power in 1998. We came in 97, but it was ratified in 98. The United States has still not ratified it. And they're very slow to ratify anything else, quite honestly, because they feel this is depriving them of their sovereign freedom to act. And very often it's their technology, their money. So why should they share it? But that's the most important convention Then the other very important summit, the Rio Earth Summit of 1992, when a whole series of important agreements, conventions, declarations were made. And the two I picked on here are the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity. The COP26, COP27 references, these are conferences of the parties. And you probably absolutely must be aware we've just had COP27 of the Climate Change Convention in Egypt. And we had COP26 in Glasgow last year, which was a moderate success in persuading countries to agree to set targets for climate emissions. Egypt is largely seen to have been a failure because, in one important regard, the definition of renewable energies or low emission energies was watered down to allow more gas than the previous COP26 definition would have allowed. But it did come up with this other important point of justice. How do you make amends for the actions of the major powers on the smaller countries who are losing out with rising sea levels, for example? And the Egypt COP27 did come up with, it's actually set up a fund. It hasn't got any money in it, and no one's committed to put any money in it, but they've set up the vehicle whereby countries can put money in to fund poor countries like Tuvalu, whose whole country is going to disappear under the waves in the next few decades. So how do we deal with the justice of that and deal with the refugee crisis that stems from it? So justice has become a key feature. We see it in COP27, that the smaller countries say, we demand justice. We demand reparations, or we demand compensation, or we demand the means to protect ourselves. And when I come on to the BBNJ, again, this new treaty has a big focus on justice in its terms, which persuading the bigger countries to give up something to be just to the smaller countries is quite tough. So just picking out some of these features from the BBNJ treaty, there's a big focus on sharing. The extreme right of the screen, written vertically, is common heritage. There was a declaration in 1972 by the United Nations that the resources of the high seas are the common heritage of mankind. They did use the word mankind. In other words, that all those seabed minerals, the value of those minerals, belong as much to Tuvalu as they do to the United States or any of the big countries. The mechanisms for dealing with that are still in their infancy and still disputed. But they did establish then, under the Law of the Sea Convention, they established an international seabed authority to license and administer the recovery of minerals and the distribution of the revenues fairly amongst all the countries in the world, having paid the costs of the countries who've gone to the extent of actually recovering them. So we're moving, or it's trying to move, from a position of where sovereign countries have absolute freedom to act to one where you've actually given it to some kind of international jurisdiction, or in American Republican horror terms, world government. World government is an anathema to very large, probably a majority of countries in the world. So there's this target to share. And there's quite a lot in the first few clauses in the BBNJ about marine genetic resources, that as we explore the oceans, we find resources which are good as pharmaceuticals or nutrients or whatever, and that those marine genetic resources should be shared by all countries and brought under international jurisdiction. There's a big focus on least developed states, on helping least developed states, and in respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. So this treaty is placing a big focus on justice and sharing, respecting the rights of everyone in the world, and a transfer of technology, transfer of resources, transfer of technology to lesser developed states. So that's one of the big features which comes out first. And then there is quite a lot about ABMT's, area-based management tools. So thinking back to where I started with these designated protected areas, it sets up a process whereby much more of the high seas can be designated for protection. Marine protected areas, marine management areas, fisheries exclusion zones, and whatever. So it's introducing measures and ABMTs. And then, very importantly, just in the bottom there, there's EIA obligation and EIA operationalized. This is environmental impact assessment. That before anyone can undertake economic activity in the high seas, they have to conduct an environmental impact assessment in both natural environment and human environment terms as to what that might mean. Now, there's actually, that is already a provision in the Law of the Sea Convention from 1982, Article 206, I think. But it allows the individual countries to be judge and jury. They're required to do an EIA, but they decide whether it's necessary, and they decide what the results are and how they should modify their plans in order to comply with the EIA report. What this treaty tries to do is to place an international EIA obligation on countries and to operationalize, those are the words it uses, to operationalize the provisions of the previous clause by placing it in the hands of an international body. So you have an international scientific body, you have a compliance committee, and you have an obligation to undertake those EIAs. And that is one of the areas, the definition and the working of that obligation is one of the things that's holding things up. How much are the countries who are likely to be undertaking economic activities in the high seas, how much are they prepared to give in terms of their sovereign freedom to act to an international body or, inverted commas, world government? And then it introduces, which we don't have in the Law of the Sea Convention, the Conference of the Parties. The Conference of the Party idea where you meet every year, and every 5 years you have a big one. You can review how the convention is working and make modifications and change it as you go along. We don't have that in the Law of the Sea Convention, which means that it has become rather outdated and really needs major review. But at the moment, that's not on the card. But within the BBNJ, there is provision for Conference of the Parties. Now, this is going to on land. We're going down to the Antarctic and the Antarctic treaty system, because this kind of international control, which the BBNJ envisages and tries to introduce does exist. The Antarctic Treaty, which started off as a rather little 11-article treaty in 1959, has since mushroomed out into a number of other treaties to become the Antarctic Treaty System, most important part of which is the Madrid Protocol, which takes it out to 2048, which preserves the Antarctic continent for scientific research, no nuclear, no mineral extraction, no economic activities, apart from tourists, a problem. Everywhere people go is a problem. But again, you have to go to the Antarctic Treaty Commission for those permissions. So the Antarctic Treaty Commission is in effect the government of Antarctica, because there is no single government control. Antarctica is governed under these treaties, and the Antarctic Treaty Commission makes the rules and issues the licenses and says what can happen and what can't happen. It is a model of international control. It's often held up as such, but of course people are nibbling around the edges. There were territorial claims to Antarctica. Australia, New Zealand, Norway, UK, Chile, Argentina, not the United States, not Russia, had claimed areas. And all those territorial claims haven't been expunged. They've been placed in abeyance. And you're now starting to get Australia's nibbling at the idea of getting more control of the exclusive economic zone of Antarctica to exploiting some of the resources in Antarctica. China's making noises about economic activities in Antarctica. So it is by no means safe, because a treaty only works as long as the signatories agree, they volunteer to be part of the treaty, and they can withdraw from the treaty, as Mr. Trump has done, as we have done in the United Kingdom by withdrawing from some of our European-based treaties. And Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, COP21, under the Climate Change Convention. So people volunteer to be part of these treaties, they can pull out. So there's always that risk of how strong would international action or condemnation be if a country says, I'm no longer going to be bound by these provisions. So it works, it's international, it's a model, but it is under threat. At the other end of the globe, we have a situation which is an unintended consequence of the Law of the Sea Convention, because under the Arctic, of course an ocean, not a continent, but the Law of the Sea Convention allows those 5 countries to claim the resources under the whole of the Arctic ice sheet. It was never envisaged in 1982 that that would ever be a possibility. But as the ice retreats, it very much is. So it's United States, Russia, Norway, Denmark, and Canada. So what next? And what can each of us do as individuals? I mean, these are geopolitical questions, they're big questions. They take years and years to negotiate with teams and teams of lawyers and diplomats. We need more diplomats. We need more negotiation. We need more powerful negotiation to be certain. But most of the things that happen because the public's demands it. Public support demands it. The Whaling Convention and the Whaling Moratorium only happened because the public demanded it happened. The anti-dumping elements of the various pollution conventions only happened because the people demanded it. They became outraged when Shell, for example, wanted to dump Brent Spar somewhere in the high seas, or Glasgow took all its sewage out 12 miles and dumped it in the sea. Public outrage said, no, that's got to change. So there has to be public support because politicians will act on public support. One of the key areas broken down into two are the NGOs. Governments have to be diplomatic. They can't call out countries in a way explicitly perhaps they'd like to be able to do. Or they get into trouble if they do, or they water it down into some kind of diplomatic language. NGOs don't have to be so concerned. They can call countries out for bad behavior. And whether it's with the larger NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund, Friends of the Earth, or whether it's with the more, and there's those I put in the class of NGO pressure, or whether it's some of the more rebellious groups, Greenpeace perhaps, the Sea Shepherd Society certainly, Just Oil, people who actually go out and do things which upset a lot of people, upset us if we can't get to work or we can't get to hospital or whatever. But those two forms of NGO behavior, NGO pressure and NGO action is important. And then science, the better we know what we're dealing with, of course. But although, as I said at the start, it's the economic activity which is very often driving the science, just around here, the work that we've done here in this institution and other institutions has been driven by the renewable energy industry, the wave energy industry, the wind energy industry, tide energy industry, wanting to conduct some kind of economic activity, which has driven a big scientific investigation of how the oceans work, what's there, and how they work. And the knowledge of that is still pretty basic. So there are things we can do as individuals, but it does require pressure. It does require persuasion. And above all, it requires diplomacy, compromise, and cooperation to get all these countries to agree. Thank you.